I'm just hoping, I'm getting some feedback. I just want to make sure everybody is muted except for myself there. There we go. All right. So I want to continue with our second series, where there's four on housing authority. So today is the 14th, and today I want to focus on, I'll just trying to figure out how to move my screen here. There we go. What I want to do today is I want to focus on how do you actually establish and implement a housing authorities. We're having a little bit of a conversation earlier, is that a lot of communities call their departments or organizations housing authorities, but there's actually a legal structure around how they should function. And before the seminar, I sent out a few documents, and one in particular, everything you ever wanted to know about housing authorities and to establish one in First Nations. If you didn't get that, I noticed some new people, and my friend Beverly Bull is online. Hi, Beverly. We can resend that to everybody, and I had a number of. So I think it's important everybody gets their hands on those and read them. What I want to do is I just want to recap the definition of housing authorities. Again, it means different things to different people, but in its truest form, it's an organization that's incorporated either into the federal or provincial legislation as either a corporation or a not-for-profit entity, or you can even call it a society. But there is a legal structure of how that needs to proceed forward. And again, it's been my experience that people are calling housing departments, they're renaming them housing authorities, but in fact, they're not housing authorities. They're just a rename of a housing department and functioning as a housing department. And under our third webinar, we'll talk about arm's length relationships and independence and how that all functions within the governance structures. And we can show how, in fact, a housing authority is independent. I think the key here, we'll talk about more, but the key is organizations that are incorporated. Basically, you're demonstrating to the financial institutions, people who want to invest in communities, that you have a sound legal structure. If you talk to financial institutions and they're moved towards, investment in housing, they're a little skittish to provide monies and to invest in large-scale projects because they want to see that corporate structure in place. And that's telling the banks that, okay, we have a governance model, we understand the requirements, we understand our reporting, we understand performance, accountability, and it makes investors, a much better comfort level. Housing authority, as I mentioned, is an arm's length housing management body, and I mentioned some communities, don't really have that legal structure. And what we want is really to have a housing authority that is incorporated with the proper governance in place, and that there's a clear distinction between a housing department and a clear distinction what a housing authority is or should be. So how a housing authority, community consultations. This is it's critical that, and I always argue, you have one chance to jump out a window on community consultations, especially on housing authorities. And what happens is under community consultations, it's important to really stress how they function, independent decision making. Council's no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of housing. They're no longer involved in allocation of homes. Maintenance of homes can substantially improve. You get better investment in housing, and housing authority also comes with the paying of rent, and you need to pay rent in order for the homes to be repaired. Generally, housing authorities, it's a major change from status quo, and the arguments that our current function, they don't work. And they also require a lot of visions and leadership. I've done several community consultations on housing authorities, and to my surprise, community members, once you explain how it works, how it functions, that rent needs to be paid or some fee to be paid, generally there's an acceptance to move in that direction. I find the stumbling blocks on housing authority is really the leadership, because all of a sudden they're faced with this, wall where they were able, in many cases, to politicize housing allocations, but under the housing authority, that is no longer possible. So all of a sudden they say, geez, if we go to a housing authority, I can no longer allocate my family. I can no longer determine who gets these homes. I can no longer make any determination with respect to housing. And there are many communities that actually have got past this part in terms of how housing authorities function and how they proceed within the governance. It's the big issue we always have to deal with when we talk about housing authority is housing the treaty right. We know that, First Nations view housing as a treaty right and a treaty right to housing. Therefore, the federal government has fiduciary duty or an obligation by the feds to provide housing to First Nations on reserve. The federal government, they argue there's absolutely no fiduciary duty. It's not a treaty and it's not an Aboriginal right. Currently, if you look at discussions on treaty housing as a treaty right, there are no legal cases currently going forward. It's not subject to any treaty negotiations. There's no dialogue among academics who write many papers regards to infringements of Indigenous rights. We're really caught in this quandary because we know politically it's used and it's argued, but there's no supporting documents, to my knowledge. There's no supporting treaties to support housing as treaty right. So basically what happens is you have this dilemma facing many of the communities, because while there's conversation of housing as a treaty right, it's important that the housing conditions has to be improved. And we know for a fact that many communities, whether or not housing is a treaty right, it's important that to improve the housing, the strength and benefits for the whole entire community to move forward. And again, my review and our involvement in many communities, those communities that actually have got past the debate, have they succumbed to saying we don't agree? And I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that a lot of the communities, they have moved forward. They're charging rent, better housing allocations, they build better homes, and treaty rights and allocations is not part of the conversations. And in many of these communities, they have actually much better housing structures and better housing allocations.
Here now.
Any?
Where?
Way down in the corner. I say.
Oh, I'm getting. Is there any comments there? Or
Chat is when you told it to mute.
Oh, there we go. I'm just muting Darlene there. Okay.
So I had a quick question, John. Is it okay to jump in?
Please.
So basically, I think a lot of treaty nation members do believe that housing is a right through treaty negotiations or through certain other negotiations prior to the treaty, and there's a challenge that's I think that's particularly seen in terms of rent recovery or disclosure of income and having some sort of rent to care income or some standardized system that is formed to meet the operating costs of providing this rental housing, affordable rental housing for members. And often it is hard to beat that cycle, in the sense there's this inherent belief that, well, I'm a member, I've been living here on lands for all my life, so it's my right, and I should get an affordable house here. And often the rent levels are questioned, or there is not enough data about existing income and things like that. So how do we go about, sort of clarifying this? Obviously, in the formation of housing authority, the member consultation, getting their buy-in, making sure they understand what the expectations are, and what the roles and responsibilities of this housing authority will be, is all very crucial for a body like this to succeed. So it is a challenge, it is true, and I don't know how to deal with it. Anything?
No, I think you've raised some very good points, and I think the real point is you mentioned expectations, and I think that's really what happens when you move towards a housing authority, knowing the allocation of homes, of how they've been happening.
Click on audio and video.
And it really,
what does it say?
Click on audio and video at the top.
and so I just had to mute there. I'm getting feedback. So you raised the question of expectation. I really believe that that's really the crutch of the issue, right? Is if you're going to move towards a housing authority, the community collectively and holistically, they also have to move with that change, and that includes, rent that's geared to income or based on the size of the home, or based on a mortgage payment, or some allocations, or all the above allocations. Again, when we talk in the fourth seminar, we're talking about how to determine a rental allocation for many of the communities. But it's really buy-in, and it's leaving the history behind and moving forward. And in communities that actually have done that, they've actually have moved forward quite well and are building better, and people are paying rent. I've been in some communities where the income of the average family is substantially high, and the employment was fairly low, but everybody in the community expected to have a home paid for by the chiefs and councils and the council. And it's absolutely impossible to do that. Like, they just didn't have any of the revenues. And so this community was on the verge of third-party management because they could not sustain what the community was wanting. So it becomes a question of if you want to have housing paid, somehow there has to be a collection of a user fee or rent to offset those costs.
Yes. I mean, financially feasible models will all tell you that, there has to be a certain, and then a lot of these projects do rely on subsidies, but again, subsidies are only a certain term, and then, they're expected to be self-reliant. So that's another thing. To begin with, it's the question of, it's my right and I need to get affordable housing. And if I'm not able to pay the rent, then, the expectation of government taking care of it. That's one. On the other hand, if that begins, then it sort of sets a precedent and it continues versus, trying to move towards a more self-reliant model.
Those are the challenges I think a lot of communities have moving forward. Housing authority or no housing authority conversations, because under the existing financial obligations, it's really hard, and I think it's going to be even more difficult. We're going through a pandemic. We have huge government expenditures, and I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see major reductions in terms of expenditures across the board, including, I think, the allocations for spending in Indigenous communities. I'm just not sure how the government's going to continue with their allocations. So,
Thank you.
yeah, no, good comments.
Hi, John.
So, yeah, go ahead.
We have one community in Saskatchewan that has actually started. It's called the Universal Shelter regime, and so we do have one First Nation within Saskatchewan that is working under this program with Indigenous Services Canada, in
Yes.
which all houses actually do end up paying rent as well as a user fee. And so it was a long process, and they had a lot of consultation meetings with the First Nation. Everybody kind of had to attend the meetings. They had to be explained how it was going to work, what it was going to do, what it was going to cost them, so on and so forth. And so it's only started. I think it was September, October of 2019. So it's still kind of in its infancy, but from the way that they have it worked out and the way they're kind of looking at it on paper and such, it looks as though it's going to work pretty well for them. So we have a number of other communities that are actually watching them to see how this is going to work, because if they end up finding that it is going to allow them to be able to be building more houses, to be renovating the stock that they do have at this time and such, that I think it's something that a lot of other communities may start to look into. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well, because this is, almost kind of a way of having a bit of a housing authority. But I think this community is also looking at creating a housing authority as well as using the universal shelter regime.
Thanks, Troy. Yes, that's actually Verity's First Nations. David Cameron's been very instrumental moving that forward. I think they're absolutely doing some fantastic work, and it was huge growing pains for the community to get to where they're at. But now I've been watching them quite closely too, and I think it's remarkable what they're trying to do. And matter of fact, in our podcast for season 3 on Home the Res, we actually have David Cameron talking about the rental regimes along with Roxanne Harper as one of our podcasts, because I just think it's really fantastic stuff what they're trying to do. Yeah, good comments. I always forget to mention Verity's, but it's been they've been moving, taking them years to get where they're at, and I think it's terrific. So groundworks to establish that.
Sorry, it's Darlene Sherby here from Smith Point First Nation.
Hi, Darlene.
We couldn't get on, so we're on the phone, but watching at the same time. All of us here are in the housing business. I'm the housing director, and sitting with me is Simon Chief, our maintenance, Owen Presso, he is in maintenance, and Mark Reynolds in maintenance.
Welcome.
I know we all missed one person.
Yeah, we can see, I can see the 4 yous there through the camera there, so. Okay, so Groundwork for establishing a housing authority. Again, once the community, assuming the community agrees, yes, let's, becomes a question of selecting an implementation team. This really involves a lot of communications, somebody who's going to set up the legal structure. Usually the implementation team are sometimes called the first board of directors. Basically, you want people who can try to move forward at the same time understanding, conflict of interest, code of ethics, issues that may involve themselves moving forward towards a housing authority. The team could also include the housing managers, usually the existing housing manager and the band administrators. They actually become quite instrumental as well in setting up a housing authority. And again, understanding the assets of the housing department, it's a large asset. So you want to make sure that there's continuation involved with the chief financial officers or the band administrator or even the counselor to help set that up. And as I mentioned, it's usually is the first directors of the board. So we want to set up a housing authority. I'm usually suggesting a band council resolution. And the reason I say that is I've been involved with a few of the communities where the community agrees to move towards a housing authority, but the band, the governance does not want to move towards a housing authority. And I find it's really quite an interesting juxtaposition because the community wants to do it, but the elected officials and the council does not want to do it. So in order to provide clarification, a band council resolution works. And I also find they work as well because if there's a change in government or elections, or there's a change in personalities, at least there's some stability through a band council resolutions. Now, in that document I provide to everybody, which we called was the Everything You Need to Know About Housing Authority, we have sample band council resolutions that could be used. Then what's also involved is filing for an incorporation. Now, I would argue you don't need to file for an incorporation immediately. And again, I'm looking at what Rasika was talking about in Tawessawan. Like, you can move towards the housing authority, you can get the structure in place, but eventually you need to do a filing in order to show it's a not-for-profit organization. You can call yourself a not-for-profit, you can call yourself a society, but there is a paperwork that requires you can either register as a federal incorporation or a provincial incorporation. Reason, my suggestion would be many should file for a federal incorporation because you deal with a lot of the federal institutions, federal businesses. It's just easier if you decide to move into a business that's going to partner with other communities outside the province. A federal corporation will allow you to do that, where provincial would not. So it allows you lots of flexibilities. And again, it's your main source of revenues come from the Fed, so it's much easier to have a federal incorporation. To file for an incorporation for a not-for-profit, there's a whole online process. It's, there's a filing fee of $200. Again, the document that we sent out to everybody, we went through, there's a sample in there how to file for a not-for-profit. But we would also suggest using a lawyer to file for an incorporation. And again, we have that information. What's really important under a corporate is it's all the shareholders are the community. So the board members are not, or sorry, the chiefs and council are not the board members. The shareholders, the whole entire community are the part of the corporation. And again, there's a misnomer of a not-for-profit. Organizations that are not-for-profit can make monies. A not-for-profit does not allow you to share those profits with the shareholders. They have to be invested back into the objective or the purpose of the community. So, for example, if I'm an investor in Ford Corporation or, a car corporation, I want them to do really well so that I can get my dividends. Under a not-for-profit organization, that's not the case. You cannot cut dividends and you cannot share the profit to shareholders. It's got to be reinvested back into the corporation. So one of the key activities under a corporation is that you need to determine what the housing authority objectives are. So you can use these objectives if you're not going to follow right away. And that is, what's the purpose of the housing authority? Why would you want to establish it? So again, on the document we sent to everybody, we identify 22 possible, I'm just going to try to mute somebody here, sorry. There we go. I just sort of had to mute somebody here somewhere. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So one of the things with the housing authority is to set up the corporations. Chloe, can you try to mute the background for me?
I can control it from this side, John.
Oh, okay.
There is a question, several questions, if you want to look at the chat, kind of tie in.
All right. Good. Okay, I got chats here. All right. We cannot hear you. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I think you could probably skip down to are there other legal structures to consider besides not-for-profit?
Question. No. Under for a community set up for a housing authority, you either are for profit or you're not for profit, or you can be a society, which is similar to a not-for-profit, but it has different objectives. So you're either a profit or you're a not-for-profit under corporate structures. Okay. Just going down through the chat questions here. Okay, those are call-in numbers. All right, just going down. All right. Corporate as a nut systems. Okay. Would you recommend having a charity status? What are the disadvantages? Oh, that's a good question, and I think that's one for a lawyer to ask. Generally, my understanding of a charity status is that your objective is for the charitable goods, and I don't think a housing authority is for charitable goods, because then I don't think you can borrow to invest. But you have to talk to a lawyer on the difference on a charitable status. Okay, corporate objectives. So notwithstanding, as I mentioned, if you're going to set up for a corporation, you still need to identify all your objectives. So some of the objectives we identified, for example, are, to establish, construct, and maintain affordable quality housing, and are the buildings and facilities for members of the, for the community. Another one, to ensure that all housing and other buildings are built and constructed to National Building Code standards. So here are just 4 of the examples of the Housing Authority objectives. Why are these important? Because these objectives will form the part of performance and measurements of how well the Housing Authority is doing. So for example, if you use the objective to ensure that all housing and other buildings are built to National Building Codes, so one of the performance measures will be, are all new homes being built signed off by architects? Or is there a building permit system in place? Are there 6 inspections taking place during the construction? Are all homes that are being renovated, are they being inspected in accordance to fire code regulations? Are the contractors who are building, are they qualified to build? If you're using people within communities, what training has been provided to those individuals to make sure that they are building to National Building Code standards? So it's one thing, again, to set up this structure of a housing authority, and here are some of the objectives, but then you have to perform. You have to try to demonstrate that, in fact, you're succeeding in trying to meet your goals. So these are just some objectives. The other one is, is there a comment there before I move on, anybody?
Yeah, I see one from Rasika.
Yeah.
What's the best model for housing authorities that want to be a developer, an owner, operator, sort of an all-in-one?
Good question. So my understanding, and again, I'm looking at housing authorities and housing corporations off reserve, I would argue that you can still do a not-for-profit for a housing authority. I would not sure if I would go to a society, because society, I'm not sure if you can borrow monies in order to accomplish the role of a developer. So I believe you can still accomplish that goal under a housing authority by setting up your clear bylaws. There's another one. Objective 4 is mandatory. Safety cannot be compromised, so it should not be an objective, really. No, good comments. But I think in terms of the objective 4, which is to to establish, construct, and maintain affordable quality rental, the rent to own for disability members. You know, I agree, safety cannot be compromised, but it should, I would suggest it would be part of the objective to make sure that it's important and that the housing authority is going to address safety issues within the communities. Okay. So corporation bylaws, again, housing authorities that are being established, you don't need to quickly go and do a file for it right away. But one thing that you would have to address is the bylaws. And the bylaws are similar to what a chief and council bylaws are, but they set the written rules of how the corporation plans to organize its internal management. These are really critical in the sense of how they would function. So this will include issues such as code of ethics, conflict of interest, how decisions are going to be made, in-camera meetings, no-camera meetings, how decisions are being allocated. So they provide, a good decision-making structure. And again, from banks' perspective, from financial institution, anybody looking out at a housing authority, the corporate bylaw is going to be really critical on how the structure functions. So basically, it's important to point out there's the rights, there's the powers, responsibility of the shareholders, and the shareholders are the community, and the directors and the officers, those are the board members. And it basically tells them what they can do and what they cannot do in terms of the structure. So why this is important again? So a chief and council, or the chief, can no longer call the director of the housing department and say, oh, by the way, you need to do this or you need to do that. Under the corporation bylaws, the chief and council can no longer provide any direct or indirect influence on how decisions are made on housing. It's all governed by the housing authority. If you go to the website, and this just gives you an example, and why this is also important is that it gives you the structure of what a housing authority should function. And so it's got, create a not-for-profit, the role of the directors, what files and documents you need to file for accountability. It talks about creating your bylaws. So it goes through the whole processes of what should be required. These should be part and parcel of any housing authority that is not being incorporated, but they need to be part of that structure. So this website gives a good overview of how a not-for-profit organization should be established. So the big question, how do you finance a housing authority? Generally, monies from ISK or CMHC, but mainly ISK, goes to chief and council. Chief and councils are generally responsible for the monies. The ISK, my understanding, cannot give the money directly to the housing authority. So in order to do that, there has to be an arrangement made, a legal agreement made between the council that can transfer the monies through a BCR or through a legal agreement to the housing authority. And that legal structure is how the monies move from the council over to the housing authority, and that's how the monies flow. It cannot be, as I mentioned, ISK cannot give the money directly to the housing authority. And we, again, in that document we give a sample of the funding agreements. Actually, it's on page 57. I believe it's about 2 pages, and it says how the money would be allocated. If the money is being allocated, there's still a set of terms of reference, how the transfer has to take place. But there's also the requirements for audit, evaluations, there's reporting requirements, there's dispute resolution requirements. So it's not a case of, here you go, here's your bag of money to the housing authority. The housing authority, in fact, then has to provide audits, evaluations, performance that goes back to the chiefs and councils. So getting back to our conversation on objectives for the corporation, these will also become part and parcel of the evaluation requirements. Are you building the way you're supposed to be building? Are you actually doing planning reviews? So what happens is, through the funding agreements, there's that accountability process back to the chief and councils. Because ultimately, the chief and council are still responsible for, feedback here. The chief and councils are still responsible for the monies. So this is sort of the arrangement of how a housing authority is set up. So you have the chief council, and there's an arm's length relationship, which we'll talk about next week. And then the housing authority establishes a board. And then the board establishes directors. And then under the directors, you have, various departments. You can have one department responsible for landlord tenancy, for maintenance, for collecting rent, for building, for education purposes, when dealing with elder housing. But you can see the line that swings back from the housing authority board back to chief and council. And that's through audit, accountability, and processes. So at the end of the day, chief and council are truly responsible for how the housing authority functions. They're not off on their own island. They're still accountable to the chiefs and councils. Just reading a chat question here from Scott. Some municipality provinces waive property tax development fees for new housing projects that commit to being affordable housing. How can we make this a federal commitment? Good question. And I'm not sure how to answer that in the context of the housing authority, because a lot of the First Nations don't have property tax. That being said, I do know that those communities that are part of the tax commission that do collect tax actually reinvest those monies back into the communities for housing and for infrastructure. We passed out a number of documents, and I just want to go through a couple of those. So we passed out the guide, which is about 80, 90 pages. It's everything from the agreements that we talked about, how to set up the corporate structure. There's also a Home on the Res podcast on housing authorities. I think it's really great if anybody can listen to that. You can just go to the FNNBOA website under FNNBOA Radio and click on Housing Authority. Lou Moody gives, I think, an excellent presentation on how they established the Housing Authority up at Fort Nelson in Manitoba. I also passed out a community literacy document on governance for not-for-profit organizations. Again, it sets out how boards function, code of ethics, how decisions are made, recording decisions. It's and a similar document is by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. They have a really good document called Governance Not-for-Profit Organizations and questions for the to ask directors. And again, directors on board. So go back to this page here. These directors are in fact they're responsible for how the housing authority functions. And usually a board will have errors and omission insurance and board insurance to protect how they make decisions. But the directors are responsible for how the authority functions. Document by the Professional Accountants of Canada, they also give how that functions. They also have a series of not-for-profit on governance reports, which are worth reading. So as you proceed towards a housing authority, these documents are also help how to structure the board and how to address issues of conflict of interest and decision-making, which are also extremely critical. There's one question here. It's from can the chief council member staff be a non-voting member on a housing authority? Board of directors would be mostly experts in certain areas of housing development. Good question. And yes, chief and councils could become non-voting members of a housing authority board. Some refer to that as observer status, which is fine. But you don't want chief and council to become part of the vote and how the board functions. And I know that some chiefs and council would argue and say, well, wait a minute, we're accountable, but we're not on the board. Well, this gets into the whole discussion of arm's lengths, and which we'll talk about more next week. Yes, and board of directors be mostly people who have expertise in housing, but also people you would like to reach out to an accountant, somebody who understands financing, somebody who's very involved in the community, so not necessarily on housing. If you can, even if you get somebody who understands building, or somebody who's done building who's retired to sit on the board. Those are some very good choices. So we have a few minutes here to reach out for any further questions or comments. I'm just going through the chat here. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes.
Often in communities, you see that members are very actively involved in, basically believing with the belief that housing is a right, and especially where they look at it as something that's giving them the security that they need. So in terms of the housing authority, if there is a strong desire of some members being part of that, we are talking of this arm's length, and I do acknowledge that you'll be talking about it in the next session. However, this question was related to the decision makers like chief and EC, the actual staff who are in the land and housing development can be the non-voting type of members. However, what about some member leaders from the community themselves? And the concern that sometimes that might bring in individual preferences or agendas versus looking at the overall benefit for the community and the big picture.
Good questions. And I know that's been raised in other housing authorities, and that's why it's extremely important when you set up the governance, you have clear conflict of interest guidelines established, you have clear disclosures, agreements, so that anybody's raising any issues, that they're being really clear that they're not in any conflict, and will remove themselves from any decision making that they may be in conflict with. So, and I know it's hard for some communities because, of the relationships and family members. Yes. But generally, if you have a strong conflict of interest guidelines and clear disclosures, you should be able to address many of those issues. And again, they have to be governed by the persons involved in the board. So again, you have accountability.
So then a follow-up question to this is, have you seen, from your experience, have you seen a model where you actually have a housing authority, which is an arm's length body, which has, possibly some experts in specific sectors like housing financing or, operations or whatever else. And then you have a sort of a housing committee that is comprised of the local members. So basically, the housing committee is a representative of the whole community, and is a committee that is basically communicating with this housing authority in terms of everything, like issues, concerns, needs, everything else. So instead of this housing authority dealing directly with every member, there is a like an established formal housing committee that actually is a fair representation of the members, in terms of elders, youth, and other members from the community. And the housing authority really gets all their direction and everything from this housing committee. Have you seen such models, and do they work better in terms of functioning?
If good comments. If you go to the podcast Home on the Res, the one on Housing Authority, Moody, who is head of their housing authority up in Fort Nelson, he talks about those issues of how they establish a housing authority and how they have actually housing committees that are actually feeding into the authority and how they're moving and how they deal with all those issues. So listen to the podcast. And if you want, we can reach out to each other after, and I can actually put you in touch with Lou. And you can talk further with him. But a lot of those issues you raised, we did a podcast on that.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's Harry Miller here. John.
Harry?
Yes, I guess the whole thing about housing authorities has to do with rental housing, almost always. But government programs are only going to come up with about 10% of the houses needed in the next 10 years. So what we're looking at Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council is how to get more houses outside of government funding. And the answer, of course, is build them yourself. But that means you have to own it. And so that means an agreement with the chief and council that you have the right to use a particular parcel of land. Is a simple agreement, a simple contract. And if people build their own house, then they would own it. And that puts them outside of a housing authority. Interesting. I think if we could actually morph some of those rental houses into houses that people own themselves, that would simplify the problems facing housing departments. Mainly because they take responsibility for repairs and this sort of thing. Anyway, I guess all I'm saying is that rental housing is a problematic sort of thing, but the alternative, I think, is for people to own their own houses, and that opens up a whole new way to have houses on reserve.
Yeah, no, very good comments. And one thing that we don't really talk about that much on housing authority is land tender, and that's a whole other topic. But allocation, land tendering within First Nations and land registry, and then having that person gain monies or access to monies to build their own homes. Yeah, it's a vicious circle, call it for what it is for a lot of these communities, because there's a major shortfall. There's a shortfall of housing, and they need to try to gain the revenues. One advantage of a housing authority and having a proper governance structure is that there's a good possibility that you could reach out to external financial people and banks and financial institutions to build, but it's a challenge.
Good point. Thank you.
All right.
Question, John, from Rudy.
Yes.
I would gather that as we discuss this, the purpose of setting up a society is for tax exemptions. I would gather that's the case, right? Or there really isn't another reason to set up a society, is there?
Again, good questions. I'm not that familiar on societies. I just generally, my understanding, I know that some that have set up a society, it's a different organized corporate objective in terms of what their humanities or what they're trying to do. And yes, all these, corporation, not-for-profit, definitely have a tax differential and tax differences. So, for example, I have my own corporation, right, for my own businesses, and then my corporation pays me my salaries, and there's I do that for legal protection. I also do that for tax purposes and investment purposes. So yes, everybody does differently, but for a housing authority to move to a society, I'm just not sure if that would meet
John,
the
I'm sorry to
legal
cut you short,
structure.
but in British Columbia, a society is a nonprofit organization. So I guess it's just semantics of what you're calling it. The reason I asked that question is I could see a benefit if you run it autonomously. That would mean that organizations that would give you funding, that would be considered a charitable contribution, wouldn't it? And they're then entitled to the tax exemption. I mean, I'm not an accountant, and I'm asking you probably questions that are out of the parameter of this, but I mean, I could see a benefit of chief and council just dumping a whole bunch of money into the housing authority and then using it as a tax exemption for charitable donation.
Good. Boy, we're into accounting.
I guess maybe I shouldn't have brought that up, John. I do apologize, but that is something that I would, use as a selling feature to a housing department authority.
Yeah, so I need to, I do know in Ontario, like again, there's the corporate, not-for-profit, and societies. Let me just look up the legal definitions, and I'll follow up with everybody on the society question. So leave that one with me. Okay. All right. I think we're good. We can have follow-up questions at the beginning. Next week, we're talking about arm lengths and how to ensure that chiefs and councils aren't sticking their finger into the apple pie on housing. And so we'll talk about that whole arm length relationship stuff. So
For clarification, John, Wednesday?
yes, Wednesday. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Oh, there's lots of people.
Oh, listening to us.
Yeah. I like the red.